As you know, we've been having parishioners share for a few minutes at the beginning of our sermons during these Sundays of Lent, this being the last, the fifth Sunday of Lent. And our speaker, our confessor, who shares today is Mary Duquesne Dillard, followed by Debie Thomas.
It's the early 1980s, and I'm in middle school. You know, that time in life that you become acutely aware of what feels unfair or fair, and friends become more and more important. So in 6th grade, my Catholic school teachers introduced a new class to us called Individual Differences, where we learned about how people are alike and different, and they taught us about words like racism and prejudice. Like, when you are prejudiced, you are prejudging a person based on your belief about their characteristics. And at that time in my life, it was a sensitive moment for understanding feelings. It made a big impact on me to consider how unfair it is to judge people before you even get to know them. The school I attended was in a mostly white suburb outside of Milwaukee. And as a part of this project, our class paired up with a sister school in another neighborhood in the inner city of Milwaukee. In reality, this was only about 5 miles away, and most of their students were African American. We became pen pals, and then we had field trips together several times a year. This was all in an effort to help us to get to know each other better. And in a lot of ways, this program helped us to make new friends and develop some empathy. It helped us to be able to appreciate each other more than if we had never had that experience. And maybe this is what inspired me to be more conscious of prejudice and racism, which led me to get involved with other recovery from racism programs throughout my adult life. But it wasn't until the events of 2020 and participating in Sacred Ground that I began to realize the depths of how I benefited from racism. That even though I know a lot about prejudice and individual differences, I still benefit from white privilege every day. It's scary to get up here before you and say, I'm a racist, and acknowledge that I benefit from racism. Racism is a strong word, and we associate it with being a bad person. This is probably why it's so hard to admit. To be a racist is a shameful thing, and I don't want to be seen as a bad person. It brings up a lot of uncomfortable feelings. But if I can't admit that the system we live in is set up to give white people advantages, and that this causes deep pain in the lives of so many people every day, and that racism actually harms all of us, how can any of us begin to come to terms with racism and take action against it? How can our society begin to recover from racism, and how can I help to repair the damage in my own little corner of the world? First, I have to admit that there is a problem and recognize my part in it. So today I'm here saying, I benefit from racism, and I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. You might remember the part of the liturgy, and we said it this morning with different words. Most merciful God, we confess that we have sinned against thee in thought, word, and deed, by what we have done and by what we have left undone. We have not loved thee with our whole heart. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. We are truly sorry, and we humbly repent. These are the types of sins we confess. I want to break free from racism and to soften my heart, to be real about what is going on and to make different choices, to be more intentional about helping to dismantle racism and learn how to be better at sharing. To say, look, this is a big problem, and I am helpless before it. and I will still make mistakes. And even so, I will make the effort. And if we as a community walk this path together, somehow we will find a way into a new way of being that truly is more fair and life-giving for all.
What does love smell like? What does grace smell like? What does hope smell like? On this 5th Sunday of Lent, as we draw closer to Jesus' final week, we are invited into a story of the senses, a story of love, grace, and hope enacted in fragrance. All 4 Gospels tell it. The story of a woman who breaks the rules of polite society, kneels at Jesus' feet, breaks what is priceless, and dares to love Jesus in the flesh. Hands to feet, hair to skin, soaked fingers to soaked toes. In the version we heard this morning, the woman is Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and the newly resurrected Lazarus. At this point in the gospel narrative, we are about 6 days out from Jesus' crucifixion. The mood in the house is troubled and pensive. By raising Lazarus from the dead, Jesus has incurred the wrath of the powers that be, and all but written his own death sentence. His days are numbered. And at least one person in the room, Mary, knows it. There is so much to say about this story. As someone who often struggles with the representation of girls and women in the Bible, I am so grateful to have Mary. A woman with a name, a woman with a plot she enacts on her own, a woman with a narrative arc. Remember, this is the same Mary who first kneels at Jesus' feet as a disciple to listen and learn, even when her culture expects her to cook and clean instead. She's the same Mary who falls at Jesus' feet when her brother dies, naming her grief, anger, doubt, and bewilderment with absolute honesty. Today, though, she comes full circle. Having been a disciple, having been a spiritual wrestler, she now becomes a bold and fearless prophet, a woman who expresses the hard truth without flinching and tenderly prepares Jesus for his death. Again, there is so much to say about the story, but I'd like to highlight just 3 aspects that I particularly love. The first is that Mary recognizes the sacredness of the body. She insists that bodies matter. As we heard in the gospel reading, what happens in this narrative happens skin to skin. Mary doesn't use words. Her yearning, her worship, her gratitude, and her love are enacted wholly through her body. Just as Jesus later breaks bread with his disciples, Mary breaks a jar in her hands, allowing its contents to spill and spread. Just as Jesus later washes his disciples' feet to demonstrate what radical love looks like, Mary expresses her love by soaking and cleansing a pair of feet. Just as Jesus later offers up his broken body for the healing of all, Mary offers up a costly breaking for the sake of compassion. Consider how Jesus responds to this celebration of embodiment. He silences the judgmental naysayers. He receives Mary's gift into his own body with tenderness and pleasure. He allows her gesture to become a holy sacrament of skin, salt, dust, and oil. He sees that Mary's piety is not an abstract piety of the mind, and he blesses her for it. What does this mean for us, I wonder, as we live in a culture that mistreats bodies in so many ways, shaming them, taming them, wounding them, ignoring them, redlining them, incarcerating them? What would it be like to recognize, as Mary does, that our bodies are precious and meant to be vehicles for worship, love, hospitality, justice, and grace? Mary's gesture reminds me that if I will not see my own body as God's temple, if I won't embrace it as delightful to its creator, I will not be able to embrace, protect, or cherish anyone else's. We are people of the incarnation, called to break bread, share wine, shed tears, and wash feet. Any version of religion that keeps us solely in our heads, unable to love ourselves and each other holistically in our bodies, is not worthy of a God who became flesh for us. The second aspect I love is that Mary honors beauty. In Mark's version of this story, Jesus tells Mary's critics that her gesture is a beautiful thing, worthy of honor and remembrance. Over and against Judas's pragmatism, Jesus celebrates the fragrant and the delectable. In doing so, he gives us permission to savor the good gifts of life on this fragile, fertile earth, the pleasures of our senses, the beauties of nature, and the fruits of human creativity and artistry. I did not grow up in a Christian tradition that put much stock in beauty. If anything, beauty was viewed with suspicion, as frivolous and distracting, a waste of time, money, and energy. So I'll be honest, Judas's criticism in this story does give me pause. Shouldn't we be sensible and cautious? Shouldn't we be guided by our strategic plans and our bottom lines? Aren't we supposed to balance our budgets? Astonishingly, Jesus says, no, not always, not at the expense of the life-giving and the beautiful. Is Mary's gift lavish? Yes. Is it useless in the practical-minded economy Judas brings to the table? Yes. Is it efficient, orderly, or logical? No. And yet, Jesus cherishes it. Think about it this way. In times of pain or trouble in your own life, what has comforted you the most? What has carried you through? The platitudes of a pragmatist, or the lavish and useless gestures of someone who adores you? Mary recognizes the importance of meeting the world's brokenness with priceless, generous beauty. Even as death looms, she chooses to share what is heartbreakingly fragile and fleeting, a fragrance, a sensory feast, a respite through art. I would dare to say that Mary's perfume is her protest. Her scented hands are her prophetic declaration. In bathing Jesus in beauty, she declares that the stench of death will not have the last word in our lives. The last word will belong to the sweet and sacred fragrance of love. When I reflect on this story, I like to imagine that the scent of Mary's perfume stayed with Jesus throughout his suffering. As he was humiliated, beaten, imprisoned, crucified, I like to imagine that hints of that sweet and love-soaked oil wafted up from his bruised feet, giving him courage and reminding him that he was loved. Likewise, I imagine that Mary didn't wash her hair for many days after she broke that jar. I imagine that she held those scented tendrils to her face and breathed them in, even as the worst of the worst happened and her beloved Lord died. I imagine that the gift of beauty connected Mary and Jesus throughout Holy Week, carrying them together through suffering, through death, through despair, all the way to resurrection. The third aspect I love about this story is that Mary consents to break what is precious for the sake of love. Many of us have spent the past few weeks reading Stephanie Speller's brave book, The Church Cracked Open. In it, Spellers uses the story of the woman with the alabaster jar as a central metaphor for the work that we are called to engage in as the church. She imagines Mary speaking to us 21st century Christians from across the millennia, calling us to be braver, bolder, more reckless, more just. In her words, quote, "You and your church, you are holding a beautiful jar. You are used to grasping it with both hands, tilting and pouring the contents with moderation through the carefully crafted spout. Someday, you will have to break it open so the contents flow free, or God will do it for you. You and your church, you think loving a thing means protecting and maintaining it exactly as it was handed to you. Someday, you will understand what it means to love something enough to let it crack apart and just sit with the pieces. Notice what needs to be removed for good, and then faithfully piece together what matters most to make something more whole, something more like what God intended all along. Someday, you will lose your life and gain real life. Oh, child, this could be one of those times." End quote. Mary, our Mary here, shared so honestly this morning about breaking through denial and naming the ways in which we've all been harmed by white privilege and racism. She named the need to cut through our illusions and complacency, our insistence that we've already done the work that needs to be done, sharing our precious oil in carefully calibrated doses. To do more than this, she admitted, is hard, frightening, costly work. After all, we like our beautiful alabaster jars. We've treasured them for a long time. And yet, in our gospel story this morning, we read that when Mary of Bethany dared to break her priceless jar, the fragrance of her perfume filled the entire house. What was once preserved and hoarded for a few became a feast for all. Privilege shared became privilege multiplied. Breaking the jar did not lead to scarcity. It led to abundance. When I think about the differences between Mary and Judas in this story, what strikes me is that Judas is committed to keeping the business of justice, equity, and generosity as abstract and theoretical as possible. His concern is for the hypothetical poor out there. But Mary's concern is for the need she finds right in front of her, the need that is urgent and compelling in the moment. Knowing what Jesus is about to face, knowing that he is in dire need of companionship and solace, knowing that the time is short, Mary acts. She loves the body and soul who was placed in her presence. Of course, in doing so, she ends up caring for the poor. She cares for the one who is denied room at the inn, even to be born. She cares for the one who has no place to lay his head during his years of ministry. She cares for the one whose crucified body requires a borrowed tomb. In other words, it is the poor Mary serves when she serves Jesus, just as it is always Jesus we serve when we break what is precious in order to love what God places right in front of us here and now. What does love smell like? What does grace smell like? What does hope smell like? It smells like one body intimately loving another. It smells like beauty transformed into sacrament. It smells like a disruptive breaking for the sake of a more just and generous world. So much is given to us in this story. What will we do with it as we set our faces towards Jerusalem? Will we choose the measured risk or the lavish gesture? Will we celebrate gifts as sacred to God, or will we hold our hearts back in judgment? That very important jar we're hanging on to at all costs. When and for whom will we break it? The time is short. Death is coming. For this moment, though, we have Jesus. What will we do with him while he's still here with us? Amen.